Hi, and welcome back to the ezJavascript introduction series. This is part 3, and we're going to continue where we left off from the previous video. Just as a reminder, where we left off, so far we have our script that reads our JSON payload, and when we hit run, it creates a new container based off the JSON definition, where we only have one container at the moment. In this video, we're going to add a sub-container to our first container, and we are going to add a geometry and set the material on the geometry. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we need to do is we need to update our JSON payload to include the new container that we want to add. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to create a new property called subnodes. So these are going to be the children, and this we can have multiple children. So we're going to have an array of objects where we're going to define each of our subchildren. So I'm going to copy the definition of our first container because every one of our containers is going to have the name, position, and rotation. So I can just go ahead and indent those, and let's call this the first child. And we're going to change this name to the parent container. Okay, so let's just reset these properties to 0 of our parent container, and now we can focus on the child container. So let's play with the x and y a bit. We'll set this to 250, and the z, let's set it to -100. We don't need the rotation here for now, so I'm just going to take that out. And now I want to create a geometry on this container. So I need to add to the JSON the definition for the geometry. So I'm going to create another property here called geom. And that's going to be an object with all the properties of our geometry. So the first thing we need to give it is a name. So which geometry we want to use. And that's going to be rectangle. And now we can set the properties of our rectangle. So I'm going to create a new property here called parameters. And this will be an array, again, another array of objects. So I want to give the parameter the name that we want to change. So this will be the width parameter of the rectangle. And it's going to be a type. So we have to pass it a float. 1 second. And the last thing we want to pass it is the value. So this will be, we want to give it a width of 80. And let's copy this. Let's give change the height property as well. So that will also be a float, and we'll give it a value of 200. Okay, it looks like we're good so far. The other thing we want to add in addition to the geometry is the material as well. So what's nice about the editor, we can also collapse structures here. So to make our code a little bit easier to read, I'm just going to collapse the geometry property for now, and I'm going to add a new one called new property called material, and this will be our material definition. So for the material, let me just go ahead and pop the editor out so we can see a bit more. So the materials in Vizrt, if we just quickly go ahead and add a material, you can see that we have different options here. We have the ambient, diffuse, specular, and emission. I'm going to start with the diffuse, and I need to set the RGB values. Okay, so we can go ahead and get rid of that. Go back to our code. So the first thing I want to define is the diffuse, and like I said, we need to pass it the R, G, second, and B values. So I'm going to make it a red rectangle. So we'll set the red to 255, RGB, and the GMB will be 0. So I think that covers it for now. Let's go ahead and update our build function to support this. So first thing we want to do is we want to create the geometry. So just like we did with the generic values and the vertex values, I'm going to create a new function called setGeom. Okay, so let's have a look. We're going to create a new function called setGeom, and I'm going to pass it two values, the target and the data. And I'm going to, the target's going to be a container, so let's define or set the type of that variable. Remember, we set @param, we give it the class that we want, and the variable that we want to set it on, which will be the target. So now target is a container. Okay. Next thing we need to do is just a little bit of error checking. Make sure that we get data. So if data is false, we're just going to return this value, this function, and not do anything more. Otherwise, we can go ahead and create the geometry on the target. So let geometry will be the target. On the target is a container, so we can do create geometry. That's a function of the container, and we want to say built in geom, and then we're going to pass it the name of the geometry that we want to set. And then we do set plugin geometry data. So the set plugin function we're going to create right now, the one that we defined here. So let's go ahead and create that one. Function set plugin target data, and let's have a quick look. So we're going to create a plugin instance. So let's define this. At param. Now instead of using container, we're going to use plugin instance, and that will be our target variable. So now I can say if target is not defined, or data is not defined, or we have the data but the data parameters is not defined, then we are going to return and not do anything in this function. So now for each parameter we need to set the values. So we're going to loop over the parameters. Let's do a for loop. Let param of data dot parameters, and so that's our for loop. So we're basically, what we're doing is inside the geom we have multiple parameters. It's an array. So we want to run this function for each of our parameters. So inside our for loop here, we're going to create a switch case. So switch, and we want to check the param type. Type. Okay. So remember, the parameter type is what we defined over here. We have a floats, and we might have a string or something else. So we're going to handle that inside the switch case. So the first case is the float. Okay, so if we have a float parameter, we can say target dot set parameter float, and we want to give it the parameter name. That's the name that we're going to change. So let's remember we have the name, the width or the height, and then we want to set the parameter value. So in this switch case, we've handled the float. We're going to just add a case for string as well. So let's add a string type, and instead of set parameter float, we're going to do set parameter string. The last thing I just forgot is in our case we need to have the break, and do the same over here. Okay, so, and we can keep adding these if we have different parameter values, so booleans or anything like that. That is the set plugin function complete, which we're calling, and the set geom function is also complete now. Let's just make sure we didn't forget anything. No, that looks good. So the last thing we need to do is add this to our main build tree function. So in our main tree, we're going to say set geom. That's our function, and we need to pass it the container, so that will be the target, and we need to pass it the geometry data from the JSON definition. So that makes that. Let me just have a quick look. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is handle support for the subnodes. So remember, the build tree function runs over this JSON definition, and we need to run that build function for each of our containers. So right now we're supporting the parent container, but we need to support the sub containers as well. So let's go ahead and do that right now. What we're going to do is we're going to check first if we have any sub containers that we need to handle. So we check if we have the subnodes property of the JSON object. If we do, we need to reverse the order. So I'll explain this in a second. Let's start without reversing. So let's loop over each sub node or sub container. Node.subnodes. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. And what we're going to do is call the build tree function, pass it the target and the subnode. Okay. So we are good to go. I'm going to close the editor. I'm going to get rid of the container manually. And now if I hit run, you can see that we have the parent container, and we've created our child container, which has the rectangle plugin. And if we have a look at the width and height, so it's set to 80 and 200. Let's check our JSON definition. We have 80 and 200, so that is set correctly. And if we change this, for example, to circle, and we run this again, you can see that it now creates a circle geometry. That's because in our setGeom function, we're passing the value from our JSON. So this is a nice and generic function that we can pass any geometry that we want to create. So the last thing I want to show before we end this video is if we create a new another subnode. So I'm going to copy this one, and let's paste it in here, and I'm going to call this one the second child, and this will be the first child. The first child will be a rectangle, And let's change the position of this one to -200 and 50 as well. Okay, so now I have two sub children containers. If I go ahead and hit run, you can see that we now have two children. But you might have noticed that the order is incorrect. That's because we're looping it through and we're adding it each time to this parent, and by default it gets added to the top. So what we actually need to do is reverse the order. Let's go back to our handling of the subnodes over here, and all I need to do is reverse the order of our subnodes. So let's go ahead and hit let reverse, and this is going to be node.subnodes. And this is the beauty of JavaScript, because subnodes is an array. Remember, subnodes, we defined it as an array in our JSON. All I have to do is hit dot reverse, which is a function of an array in JavaScript. And instead of using the subnodes, I'm going to loop over the reversed array. So let's just paste that in there. And let's close the editor and hit run. And now you can see it creates the children in the correct order. So that brings us to the end of this video. In the next video, we're going to add geometry, and later on in the series, we're going to add different sort of plugins, so control plugins and function plugins, and set their values or the settings of each plugin, just like we did with the circle and rectangle. We set the width and height programmatically. We'll do the same with control plugins and function plugins. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out the rest of the series.